Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I'm David Bird with Reality Reimagined. I'm an award-winning photographer and Photoshop artist that specializes in fantasy composite art. And today we're going to return to Oniric to discuss a few of the techniques that I have used in my recent gelled photography artwork, and also explore Aura and Flares Edition 2, which is a new custom set of brushes that I've created for Photoshop that can help you expand the offerings from Oniric. If you're new to the channel and haven't yet heard me talk about Oniric, well then, welcome to the jungle, baby, because you're gonna die! Wow, that was a moment. Anyway, Oniric is an amazing plugin for Adobe Photoshop CC 2018 and above that creates non-destructive glows and light streaks with your image. I have a few videos on the channel covering this wonderful plugin and how to use my custom brushes to create some interesting spectacle to your imagery. You can look at the description below for links to both Composite Nation, the home of Oniric, and Reality Reimagined, the home of the Aura and Flares brush sets. Now, let's hit the jungle, that is the Photoshops, and I'm not going to do another Axl Rose impression because, oh my gosh, my pipes, my poor little pipes. No. Introductions to get us started. This is my wonderful friend Danielle. You've seen her in some of the previous videos on the channel covering gel photography and Oniric. If you haven't seen those videos, then look at the card above and it will take you to them when you're done with this one. If you'd like to see more of her amazing work, visit the Instagram account at the link below. So let's talk about what we're going to do in this video. Essentially, we're going to make two passes in Oniric for light streaks. The first one is going to utilize the existing pixel information and light data within the photography and the image that we see on the screen. The second pass will use the custom brushes that I've created in Photoshop to use in Photoshop and with Oniric. Speaking of the custom brushes, let's take a look at those now. So the Aura and Flares Edition 2, like Edition 1, in the set you have brushes that are applicable for the background to create abstract shapes that the subjects can interact with, and then also in the same set are brushes to create light streaks. Now we'll be using the custom brushes to create light streaks today, but I will be making a video on the channel soon that will be using the new background brushes and showing you how to use those. A few of the folks who have purchased the brushes, they've sent me an email saying that when they install them into Photoshop, they're actually having some trouble seeing the brush view this way. So if that's true for you, when you're in your brush window, come to this little wheel icon here and then make sure that brush tip and brush name are checked and uncheck brush stroke. Brush stroke is essentially Photoshop attempting to render what this brush tip looks like if you made a consistent brush stroke with it. So it can be a really odd looking image. So go ahead and uncheck that and make sure that brush name and brush tip are selected, and then that'll make it easier for you to make sure you can select the right brush that you want to use when you're using those custom brushes. So let's take a look at the different layers and what I've already produced inside of the image using Oniric, and then we'll get started making those light streaks. First, we have two main layers, one of Danielle that's been extracted with the layer mask of the original image, and the second one is a piece of stock that I purchased from Adobe stock. I like this image because I love, of course, the color palette. It matches the color palette that I used in the photography on set, but I love the sense of flow and story that I see here. This is just a simple textured background, but with this crackling, colorful, metaphysical, magical energy that's flowing through the scene. I love the idea of using this to somehow tell a story. So with these two layers combined, what are we actually making here? Yes, this is gel photography, this is glamour photography, we're using Oniric to make cool stuff, but what we're really making at its core is a composite, where we're making a new background, putting it behind this subject and trying to tell a story with that composite piece of artwork. So what I've already done is used these two layers and I've run them through Oniric independent of each other to create a general glow. First, how did I do that and make them independent from each other? Well, I simply made a blank layer and filled it with black, so that when it's filled with black and it's turned on, then Oniric only sees the layer of Danielle. Therefore, it will only use that pixel information, that light data to create the glow effect. Once that was done, then I turned off the layer of Danielle and that black layer so that ultimately what's being revealed is just the background layer itself. Again, running that through Oniric using things like the threshold slider, the exposure slider, and the built-in mask system in Oniric to be able to take away some of the hot spots so that ultimately I could produce these two top layers, which are smart objects, and these are the two output elements from Oniric that has the glow inside of them. And before I turn them on, I essentially want to turn this into a teaching moment about composites briefly before we get to the fun of Oniric, which is when you make a composite and you have this static background that we see in this scene right now, it's just a background. Yes, it fits the scene from colors, from the leading lines of the flow of all this energy and so forth, but I need to bring it forward. So when you're making composites, find a way to bring the background forward. Let it interact with the subject. You don't necessarily always have to do that, but that is a best practice. Imagine if Danielle was standing in a building that had a lamp behind her. So we would have the background layer that was that stock image of the building with the lamp in the background. And then we have the second layer, which is Danielle. If we could add a glow to the lamp, and make that glow look like it was wrapping around the subject, wrapping around Danielle, it connects her to that background. It brings the background forward and thus increases the storytelling opportunity with this artwork. So when I turn on these two top layers that were produced by Oniric, we have the glow that is on Danielle, and now we have this magical glow of the background that is wrapping around her. It looks like she is a part of this ether of magic and energy, and it connects her to it. It helps tell the story even more than if I were to take this layer that was output from Oniric and bring it in the layer stack so it would be beneath the layer of Danielle. Her body is hiding that effect. Yes, we still see some of the glow in this area, and it still looks like a cool image, but I leave it up to you. Let me know in the comments, when you look at this, does this feel like she's a part of this environment when the layer is below her versus being at the top of the layer stack so it can wrap around her, so it can connect with her? So that's one of the teaching moments I wanted to have with this, where ultimately, when you're making composites, find ways to bring the background elements forward through the piece and let them interact with the subject. Now let's get to the fun of creating this first pass of light streaks. And this may seem a little complicated as we create this, but go along with me and it should make sense once we're able to produce the final layer that we need to take through Oniric. To get us started, what I want to do is to turn off these two layers that were produced by Oniric, just to make it a little bit more visually easy to see what we're creating. So to create this, what I want is ultimately a very thin perimeter of actual pixels from the picture of Danielle to use in Oniric. So I want to make something that would ultimately be following the actual outer perimeter of her body and then coming into the scene and then fading off, because that thin strip of pixels all the way around her body, we can take into Oniric and start strategically using it to create light streaks using this existing information instead of using something like the custom brushes. So to make this thin little selection layer, here's what we need to do. I'm going to make sure that the layer of Danielle is selected. Then I'm going to hit Control Command and the letter J to duplicate it. Then I'm going to come to this layer mask, which is the layer mask that I created when I extracted her from the image. I'm going to make sure the layer mask is selected, then right click it and choose Apply Layer Mask. Now we have an extracted version of Danielle that is a layer all by itself. Then I'm going to put a new layer mask onto this by coming down to the layer mask icon here in the layers window. And when I click this, I'm going to hold Alt or Option so that it will make a hide all layer mask. It's hiding this entire layer. Now, of course, we can still see her because this layer here, the original one of Danielle, is still turned on. So if I turn that off, she's gone. So let's begin the process of making this selection to create this outer perimeter of her, now that we have the existing layer to do it with. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on this layer just for purposes of the video, but it's not necessary to do. What I want to do is to hit Control or Command and hold it, and then click the layer mask icon of Danielle that we initially made. That's going to make an active selection all the way around her. This active selection with the marching ants means that anything inside of this selection is what's going to be affected. Anything on the outside will not be affected. So the first thing that I need to do is to contract this down, because I want to create a new interior perimeter that is where I want this to fade off from. So about, a generous amount coming down into the image of Danielle. So to contract this selection, I need to come up to Select, Modify, and then Contract. That's going to bring up the contract selection dialog. I've set it to 30 pixels, and that's a generous, pretty good amount that's going to push that selection in. So when I hit OK, the selection has now contracted down across the entire selection into her body. The next thing that I need to do is I need to feather this selection, which means ultimately make it soft on its edges so it doesn't have a defined perimeter. It just fades off into nothingness. Why would I want to do that? Well, ultimately, when the light is wrapping around her, the light will fall off. It will fade out into nothingness as the light travels. If I don't feather this, then I'm going to have a very hard, definitive edge on the interior of the selection. So the light will just suddenly stop and it will be the overall shape of her. That doesn't look very realistic to how light actually works in real space and in the real world. So I need to feather this selection. To feather the selection, I need to return to select, modify, and then feather. 30 pixels, the same amount that I pushed it in, is a good place to start, but this is circumstantial based upon any image that you're working on. So once I've done that, I'm going to hit OK. Now the selection doesn't visibly change that much. It still kind of pseudo looks like the selection. It's just gotten softer anywhere where it needs to bend in a curve. And that's okay because it is feathered, and you'll see that effect here in just a moment. Now I'm going to hit Controller Command and the number 0 to zoom all the way back out. What I need to do now is to invert this selection because I want to be able to select the outer area of all of this and reveal that part of the image, which would reveal the background, of course, but also now this part of her body. And keep in mind, this selection has been feathered as we came down into it, so it's going to fall off. So I want to reveal the outer part of her body and the background, and then we'll fix that part so we just have the selection of her. So to invert the selection, what I'm going to do is hit Control Shift and I, or Command Shift and I for invert, and that will invert the entire selection. Now again, you may not see a visible change to the selection, but it has been inverted. And the way to test that is to actually use the selection and the layer mask. So this layer mask here that we produced with the duplicate layer of Danielle has been selected. I'm going to change my foreground color to white and fill in this selection so it will reveal the background and that thin little strip of Danielle. So once that's done, I'm going to hit Alt-Option and the backspace key, and that will fill that entire mask with white. And if we look at the layer mask now, anything with white is revealing the layer, anything that's black is hiding the layer, and you can see it's fading, so that it's a little soft, it's gray and so forth here on either side of the selection, and that's what we're going to fix here in just a second, but it faded down. So the white transitions into pure black, so it's revealing this thin little strip, but fades off into nothingness. So now that we've done that interior selection of Danielle, I'm going to hit Controller Command and the letter D for deselect. Then I'm going to Control click the layer mask again, the original layer mask of Danielle, which is the original outer perimeter selection. Then I'm going to invert this selection again by hitting Control Shift and I or Command Shift and I. And then while I'm on the layer mask of the duplicate layer of Danielle, I'm now going to fill in this space with black instead of white. So if I fill it in with black, it's going to hide everything. But if you'll notice, we're on the original exterior perimeter of Danielle, and it's not been feathered. It's the pure shape of her body, and that's key. So once we've made sure that we've got that selection right, we've inverted it, we're on the layer mask, I'm simply, again, going to hit Alt or Option and the backspace key to fill in the entire selection with black. Hitting Controller Command and the letter D for deselect. If I hold Alt or Option and click the layer mask, we can see the layer mask and what it did. So now we have the original pure exterior perimeter of her body that fades into nothingness. So the area in white is what we will see of this overall selection that is the duplicate layer of her. Why did I make the exterior perimeter the original hard edge and not the soft edge? Because the light from this composite is going to be hitting her real body, quote unquote, and then wrapping around it. So when it hits that real barrier, I want that solid surface so that we see the glow. And knowing that when I'm going to put this through Oniric, it will create a little bit of a glow or a bloom where the light will expand outward from the original selection. But I wanted that hard perimeter so that as the light technically hits it, it will wrap around and then fade into nothingness. So this is the entire selection that I've made. What I'm going to do now is to right click the layer mask itself. Let's go ahead and Alter Option and click the layer mask to go back into the real view. And if I hit right click the layer mask and then hit Apply Layer Mask, and I'm going to turn off the original layer of Danielle, now we have this thin layer of her all the way around, and this is the layer that we can take into Oniric to start creating the first pass of light streaks. So let's get started doing that, and to start, I'm going to turn on the little blocking layer that I've made, the layer that is filled with black paint. I'm going to move it up in the layer stack just for the purposes of the video so that you can see that ultimately we have a layer that's filled with black, and then the next active layer that's turned on in Photoshop is the layer that we want to push through Oniric. So with that layer selected, let's go ahead and hit generate and go inside of Oniric and start creating the light streaks with this layer. Inside of Oniric, the first thing we want to do is change from diffuse, which is creating the glows, to light streaks. Then we'll click that. That will open up new options for us and new sliders to work with. What I want to make sure is I first need to see what Oniric sees of the available pixels and light information. So to do that, I'm going to check the X-ray box. Now, anything that shows up in green in this area is what Oniric sees. And at this point, it's not seeing very much. So to enable more of that and enable the possibility for Oniric to see more information, I need to increase the threshold. Right now it's at 0.25. I'm going to take it all the way to 1, or essentially a full stop of threshold. Now we're starting to see things in green, which means this is information that Oniric is seeing. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off X-ray, and instantaneously the light streak Oniric effect is taking place. And just by itself right now, it looks super cool. And I love doing this in the work that I do, not just for the human subjects, but for inanimate objects in the background like buildings or special effects and so forth. So the next thing that I want to do is to start to fluctuate these light streaks, start giving them a little bit more definition and change their rotation. And that's the first thing that I want to do, is the rotation itself. If we remember, essentially that background stock has some magical ether energy over here that travels upward and through, and it wraps around her body. That is essentially a leading line. So to follow that design principle, I want to follow and have the light streaks go in that same kind of pattern. So to get us started, I'm going to change the rotation of the light streaks to be around a 45-degree angle. And then we'll see what it looks like once it's rendered in Oniric. I think that actually looks pretty good, and something that's also key to see is that some of the intensity of the streaks have changed based upon how we want the light streaks and what angle we want them to be created at, because Oniric is using that information and creating essentially a new light streak based upon the rotation. So where the pixels are, how strong they are in luminosity can change the intensity of some of these. Now, if this is too intense up by her jaw or with her hair, we can use the built-in mask system in Oniric to try to minimize all of that. But I'd rather do that in Photoshop because I need to see the live view of what Oniric is doing with that layer against the background itself. It may fit, it may not, so I'll wait to do that inside of Photoshop using a layer mask itself. The next thing that I want to do in this, I don't need to increase the overall exposure, which will make the light streaks a little bit brighter. What I want to actually do is to increase the radius. And some of the folks that I've talked to both through YouTube and on social media that use Oniric, they've told me that they don't use the radius slider very much at all. They just leave it at its default for 20. And I've told them you need to explore the radius slider because there's actually a lot of interesting things it can do. If we minimize the radius, it's going to make the light streaks or the glows under diffuse in Oniric more localized. It's going to make it smaller to the original light source. If we expand the radius for light streaks, it's going to make them longer and bigger. But what it's also going to do is to minimize that center glow. Wherever Oniric is picking up the light data and then making the light streak, that center glow will be minimized if we increase the radius. So right now it's set to 20. Let's go ahead and slide it up and we'll take it to 39.6. That's what I thought. Yes, I'm glad you're going with me on that one. So now the light streaks have changed significantly. They've gotten a little bit longer, but those hot spots are less. They're more minimal now. And that's what I'm looking for, because with this first pass, using the existing information from the photography, I just want Oniric to create a base layer of light streaks. And then I will add to them using the custom brushes. You don't have to use the custom brushes. You can just continue to make multiple passes in Oniric at different intensities of radius and exposure and threshold and so forth, but this is the way that I'm choosing to do it, and I have gotten good results using my brushes and just this one general pass in Oniric. So let's go ahead and add just a little bit more interest to this by using the streaks detail slider. I took it up to 5, and it's just going to kind of make them a little more defined and give us ultimately more light streaks because it's defining that existing information and solidifying it into the light streaks themselves. Then I'm going to add just a touch of the light dispersion so that we get that RGB split that is indicative of real light and how a light bloom or streak would happen in the real world. If you've ever seen light go through a prism and try to photograph it, you're going to see all kinds of distortions in the spectrum, and that's what ultimately happens when light refracts off of something or through something. So once we've done the RGB split, I think everything looks good at this point. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit save. Oniric's going to render everything and then take us back into Photoshop. We're back into Photoshop. We have our outputted elements of Oniric, which again are the two original glows that I made and the new light streaks. If I turn off this helper layer that we made to hide everything and then turn on the original layer of Danielle, now we can see those beautiful light streaks that have been created using the existing information within the image itself. So what I like to do at this point is to kind of assess, is this too much? Is there too many light streaks, too much glow? Where do I need to take it away? And as I'm looking at this, I really like what I see. Yes, it looks a little bright in certain key areas, so I may want to minimize some of that. But ultimately, I think what I'm going to do with this piece is to wait until the very end during the artistic retouch process to then minimize some of these. I essentially want to build all of the options with layers in Oniric and then during the artistic process minimize some of it, because if I add some more contrast back to this or increase the overall black point within the image, I can potentially start pulling some of those glows and light streaks away gently without actually having to erase them from the image. And that's my goal, because I love what I see, but I may just have to minimize it just a little bit. So let's continue forward and create the second pass of light streaks using the custom brushes that I've created for Photoshop. And to do that, we're pretty much going to do the same thing we just did without all that convoluted mess of making that selection. And if you followed through with all of that, I thank you. You're amazing. If you didn't, I understand it can seem a little daunting to do all the selections and inverts and all that kind of stuff. Just rewatch that part of it. Practice once or twice and it will become very clear to you. It's just the sequence of making the selection, inverting it, and knowing that you're trying to create that thin little selection of pixels themselves. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off this layer of Danielle. That was the copy that we made a moment ago. And I'm going to make a new blank layer above that one layer that's filled with black. This blank layer is what I'll actually use the brushes on and stamp the brushes into the scene. So the first thing I want to do before I use the brushes is to make sure that my foreground color is set to white by hitting the letter X. And then I'm going to hit B for brush to make sure that I'm on it. I want my flow and opacity to be set to 100%. And then I'm going to come up to the brush window, and then I'm going to scroll down and find one of the light streak brushes that I want to use. So in this case, I think what I want to do is I'm going to use this one, Streaks number 9, because it has a nice natural bend into the brush itself, as we can see if we zoom in and see the shapes of the brush. And where I want to put the brush is over here on her right shoulder, her neck, and a little bit of her bicep. Why do I want to put it there? Well, when we made that layer of Oniric and used the existing light information, Oniric needs light. It needs brighter sources of pixels to be able to create the effect. And in this case, she's wearing a leather jacket that just wasn't reflecting a lot of the light that was on set. Now, I can add artificial light to that selection by using levels, adjustment layers, curves, and so forth. But the more that I start adding fake light to these pixels, the more that it's going to blow out the pixels, because simply they were just not recorded and captured by the camera with a lot of available light into the scene. So I need to use the custom brushes to create fake light and these little particle patterns to give Oniric something to build off of to create interesting light streaks. So I'm going to use the left bracket keys to make my brush just a little bit smaller, and then I'm going to hold Shift and the left arrow key to start rotating the brush in even degree increments. And then I can just stop holding Shift and use the left or right arrow keys to rotate it back and forth in smaller degree increments. And then I want to get the brush center pretty much in the angle that I'm looking for. I may reduce the size of the brush just a little bit more, but note, when you reduce the size of the brush and then stamp it into the scene, you're ultimately reducing how many pixels Oniric can pick up to make the streaks. So this may seem like a duh kind of statement, but I just want to state it here in the tutorial that if you make the brush really small and run it through Oniric, you're going to get very few light streaks, if any at all. You need to potentially use a larger brush, make the streaks, and then just use a layer mask in Photoshop to paint some of them away, or warp the light streaks, which is what we're about to do. So Once I know that the rough size of it is going to kind of pseudo work, and I'm on my blank layer that I created here, painting with white at 100% flow and opacity, I'm going to stamp the scene 2 or 3 times just to make sure that I get all of the paint down with the brush shape. Now with this layer active, I'm going to hit V for the move tool, and so I can see the overall shape of it. Then what I want to do is I actually want to warp this layer. I want to contort it so that I can bring the bottom left edge in so it connects with her body and extend the upper right edge of this layer up so that it connects with her neck. So to warp it, I'm going to come up to Edit, Transform, and then Warp. Now it's going to turn the entire layer into something that I can start moving around and distorting, much like how you would use liquify inside of Photoshop. With warping, you have a bunch of different options that you can control it with. First, starting with these little circles on all the edges, and these are just essentially anchor points that you can start distorting the entire piece with, or you can use elements like these that you can create splits and a grid inside of it to divide up certain parts of it to really get a finesse and control. For today's purposes of the video, these things are a little bit complex to use. I'm simply just going to use the anchor points and start moving this brush stroke shape into alignment, curving it where I want it to be, using the anchor points and stretching them to fit the overall scene. And I don't necessarily have to use the circles. I can just click anywhere inside of the selection itself and start moving the pixels around. And once I get them into a rough shape of where I want them to be, I will hit enter to accept that transformation, that warp control. And now that one brush shape that we just made is now been contorted to fit the overall alignment of her shoulder and her neck based upon this pose in the image. So once that's in place, I'm going to turn on the black layer so that Oniric will only see this layer filled with the information that we just painted. Now, yes, there's other layers turned on with colors and lights and so forth, but these are Oniric elements, and Oniric knows to ignore them when you're running it through the generation of creating the Oniric effect. It will only pick up this information of the layer that we just stamped. And it is important to turn on this layer of black because ultimately this, even though there's no light data in here, this is pixel information because it's just filled with black. So it expands the space and the canvas, if you will, in Oniric so that you have more room to create the light streaks and so forth. If we just try to run this one layer through Oniric, we may not have the entire perimeter outside, and it makes it difficult to see what it's actually creating because it's just creating the light streaks against nothing, so it's hard to see visually in Oniric. So once this layer is selected, I'm going to click Generate and go into Oniric to create the second pass of light streaks. Now inside of Oniric, we're going to do the same thing that we did before, switch to the light streaks themselves, get the new controls that we can work with, turn on X-ray to see what Oniric sees. It sees a few of the dots, but not all of them. So let's go ahead and increase the threshold all the way to a full stop. Then it should see all of the dots. Let's turn off the X-ray. We already have our light streaks. We need to take the rotation back to what we did before, which was 45 degrees, and it will match the rotation of the other light streaks that we have already created. I'm going to take a few steps back so we can see the overall view of this. Now let's go ahead and increase the radius just a little bit. It's going to make the light streaks longer and minimize the overall glow. Let's go ahead and increase the exposure this time as well, because again, there's not a lot of information there. So the more that we make it brighter, the more the light streaks will be picked up and we'll have some of them. We can add a little bit of that light dispersion. And then we can also add a little bit of the streaks detail. With the custom brushes, when you do streaks detail, it can sometimes actually minimize the amount of streaks just depending upon which brush you're using. But ultimately, it's just refining them a little bit more. So this is something you should experiment with to see what you want to create. Now, at this point, I do have the option to colorize these and change them to be purple or magenta or whatever I want them to be. But I usually don't do this option on Oniric. I will take it back to Photoshop and use a hue saturation adjustment layer to add that color. And the reason why is because I want to see a live view of the color changing to match the background. And I can't do that here because we didn't give Oniric access to the background image when we brought it in. Because if we did, it would also be adding a glow and streaks and so forth to the background stock. And I don't want to do that. So all of this looks good. I'm going to go ahead and hit save and we'll go back to Photoshop. In Photoshop, we have our layer produced with our light streaks into the scene. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the black layer. And I'm also going to turn off the layer that was the original brush stroke layer that we made, because the white dots are still very visible in the scene. But if I turn them off, now we have our new fake artificially created light streaks that we can strategically place into the scene using something like warp to be able to bend them to fit the overall design. Now, coming up to this top layer here, this is the Oniric element that was just produced. I'm going to come down to my adjustment window, and I'm going to create a hue saturation adjustment layer, and then I want to clip it to the layer of Oniric that we just produced, so it will only affect that layer. And so to clip it, all I have to do is put my cursor in between the two layers and hold Alt-Option, and it will defer the hand tool over to this square with an arrow. When I click once, now this little arrow means that ultimately the hue saturation adjustment layer is clipped to the layer of Oniric, and it will only affect it there. So now with this visual live view that I have, I can hit colorize on the properties control for the hue saturation adjustment layer, increase the saturation, and then move the hue over to the purples. And I can start moving it back and forth. Do I want to favor the blues a little bit, more of the purples and magentas? And this is what I meant by having that live view, because if I hit Controller Command and the number 0 to zoom all the way back out, I can make some of these streaks match more of the blues and the deep purples that we see into this background. It doesn't just have to be the magenta. And for the design part of this, I actually want to do that. I want to favor a little bit more of those purples, because if it's the same magenta that we see of the glow that's coming in wrapping around her, we could potentially lose the light streaks themselves and not really see it in the overall design. So I've added some of that color to it. Again, this is something that can be adjusted because it's a hue saturation adjustment layer. We're not making these changes directly to the layer from Oniric. And I like the look that I see. I'm just going to fidget with it just a little bit more, and I think that looks good. The last thing that I want to do is to make a levels adjustment layer and clip it to the same Oniric layer that was just produced. And we're going to do the same thing, put our mouse between the two layers, hold Alt-Option and click it, so we have that little arrow. Now we'll only affect the light streaks themselves, and I'm simply going to make the light streaks just a little bit brighter by moving over the highlights and shortening this distance, then taking the midtones and making them a little bit brighter as well, so that we can see the light streaks and they are much more visible now into the overall scene. Now the final thing that I want to do before I get into the artistic enhancement of this image is these light streaks, because of that custom brush, I think these are just a little too much. So utilizing the layer mask that came with the layer from Oniric, I'm simply going to hit B for brush, come back up to the brush window, select the original soft round brush. And just a side note, this soft round brush is not included in the custom brushes on the website, the Reality Reimagined website. This is just the soft round brush that is a default from Photoshop. I moved it into this folder for the purpose of the video. So here I'm going to simply start painting black at a flow of 10% and just start arbitrarily picking some of these streaks that I can start painting and fading away. So I'm creating some visual interest, making it further have a sense of realism of where it's coming into the scene, how it's interacting with the layer of Danielle, and so forth. So making those two passes of light streaks, both using the existing information in the photography by making that interesting selection and then using the custom brushes themselves, I'm able to start creating all of these light streaks that I can work with the glows and the background to create this interesting fantasy cyberpunk cool gelled composite. And I now want to take it even further. So what I'm going to do before we have our final thoughts is I'm going to add a few more light streaks using the custom brushes. And then I'm going to take the image through the artistic process itself to finalize everything. So let me do all of that, and then we'll finish up with our final thoughts, reviewing the final piece of artwork and discussing what we created today. So the artwork is complete, and let's take a look at what I produced. Ultimately, this piece had 10 different passes in Oniric using the custom brushes in Photoshop to create the light streaks. And the design idea was simple. I just wanted to interact with the light streaks anywhere where the background interacted with her. Wherever it connected and told that story of that magical ether traveling across her, I added those light streaks into the scene. Doing it in the same way that I demonstrated before by stamping the brush onto a blank layer, taking that into Oniric, using radius and threshold and exposure, and then bringing it back into Photoshop using a hue saturation adjustment layer to add color to it, and then just using the layer mask itself to minimize some of the light streaks in certain areas to give it a general sense of flow and drive that direction and the storytelling with the piece. From there, I just went through an artistic retouch to the image, paying attention to things like color, luminosity, and detail, which those three elements to me are the foundation of any type of artwork or any type of retouch you would do in Photoshop itself. What I love about this process and what I love about Oniric is that it can be utilized to work on so many different levels and achieve so many different tasks in art making in Photoshop. And the possibilities are just limitless. Using the custom brushes that I have enable you to be able to go a little bit further and find areas where you want to add those streaks or add other colors and scenes and elements that can help tell the story, help bring your artwork into focus to match what you see in your imagination. In the description below is a link to compositenation.com where you can get your copy of Oniric, as well as a link to Reality Reimagined to get the copy of the custom brushes that I have created. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you like the content you found in it, make sure to give the video a like and consider subscribing, because new content debuts each week in photography and Photoshop education. And when you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of that new content when you return to the YouTubes. Thanks again, and until next time, I'll see you out there in the world of Photoshop.